was younger and in school, just like all of you, I remember this group of friends that I would hang out with all the time. We were so close. It was probably like 3 or 4 guys and probably 5 or 6 girls, and we were just like inseparable. And I remember we did everything together. We went to church together, we went to school together, we would hang out together on the weekends. I mean, we could not be pulled apart. And of course, that means that the more time we spent together, I'm sure if you know, a lot of you know this, we would sometimes get into like little arguments. Well, there was one girl who she and I just kind of butted heads a lot. We were really close, but we didn't always see things the same way. And I remember this one time we got into this really intense argument to the point that she was yelling at me. And I didn't know how to take that because, you know, who likes to be yelled at, right? And I was so angry about it that later when me and a couple of the other friends in the group were talking about it, I was tempted to just start saying things about her that I knew would be hurtful. And when you think about that idea and talking about people behind their back, you know, I knew at the time that like that's not just something that you do. And I was tempted to do it, but I knew that it had potential to damage. But I think that I was so angry in the moment that I just let it go. And I said something about her that was really hurtful to one of my other friends. Well, fast forward a couple days later to the next time that we all saw each other, and she came straight up to me and confronted me about it and said, "Did you say this about me?" And there I was, stuck. And I think the worst part of it was when I realized how much I had hurt her with the thing that I had said to my other friend. It ended up splitting up our group for a little while. We had one group of us that took my side, the other group of us that took her side, and it just became this big mess. And I'll never forget that. You know, sometimes we want things that aren't necessarily great for us in the long run. And we call that temptation. Think of it like this. Temptation is the desire to do something we know might not be the best for us. As you get older, the kind of temptation you might be facing is so much more intense than the kind you dealt with when you were younger. Being tempted to take a cookie from the counter when your mom told you not to is small stuff, compared to being tempted to cheat or steal or lie or make a choice that could have big and painful consequences. As you get older, a lot of our temptations get bigger, and so did the consequences. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe the temptation you gave into wasn't the same as mine, but you probably know the feeling. You've given in and done something you knew wasn't good for you. And then, well, like me, you were probably wondering, what do I do next? Maybe we feel stuck after we've given in to temptation. We're stuck with feelings of guilt and embarrassment and defeat and shame. We worry what people will think if they find out what we've done. And if people do find out, we fear they'll never see us the same way again. Or maybe the opposite is true for us. We've heard all this stuff about how giving into temptation can be bad or wrong or awful, but if we're honest, we don't feel any of that. We don't really feel guilty at all. Maybe it's because we don't think what we did was wrong. Or maybe because we've been doing it for so long, we don't even know the difference anymore. Or maybe because everybody else acts like it isn't a big deal, we feel the same way. Now, whatever the reason, giving into temptation doesn't feel all that bad to us. Or maybe we get upset. We might blame other people for what we did. After all, that's easier than taking responsibility ourselves, right? Our friends made us do it. Our teacher gave us way too much to study for the test. That's a stupid rule we had to follow anyway. We look to blame everyone else but ourselves when we give in to a temptation. Maybe we try to hide what we did. We want to cover it up. We avoid the person who's upset with us. We make excuses for what we did or where we were. We might even lie to deny the whole thing. We will do whatever it takes to make sure nobody finds out. Why? Because we know what we did was wrong and we don't want to face the fallout. Each and every one of these feelings or responses when we give into temptation is normal. They're things we all might do, but the reality is they don't make things better. In fact, dealing with temptation in these ways usually makes things worse. So what do we do? When we've given into temptation, how are we supposed to respond? To start over, to change the path we're on? When it comes to temptation, what's the best thing we can do once we've given in? Well, to help us figure that out, we're going to talk about a guy named David. Believe it or not, David was one of the biggest heroes in the Bible. He lived before Jesus came to earth, and his story is documented in the part of the Bible called the Old Testament. Now, when we first meet David, he was just a shepherd boy, just a little boy. But by the time his story was through, God called him to so much more. He eventually became king, and God said he was a man after my own heart. That's pretty huge. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear all that, I think this David guy must have had it all together. He probably lived right, he never made mistakes, and he never gave in to the kind of temptations that would mess up the good things he had going on. But that's not exactly how David's story went. When David was king over Israel, he was doing a really great job. He was winning a ton of battles, his kingdom was growing, and his people really liked him. Basically, this dude was the greatest of all time, the GOAT! But things changed on one fateful night. David couldn't sleep, so he got up out of bed and wandered to the roof, and then he noticed a beautiful woman named Bathsheba bathing across the way. Okay, now I know it's getting a little PG-13 up in here. So when he saw Bathsheba, what did David do? I mean, this was a man after God's own heart. He was the chosen king of Israel and a leader everyone loved. So obviously he walked away, went back into his room, and nothing bad happened, right? Wrong. David actually invited Bathsheba over to hang out, and well, they gave into some temptations they definitely shouldn't have. Especially since Bathsheba wasn't David's wife. In fact, she was actually married to someone else completely. A man named Uriah who was out fighting in David's army. Talk about the drama. So after all this, did David tell anyone about what happened with Bathsheba? Did he apologize or try to make it right? No. He just pretended like it never happened. And for a while that seemed to work, but then Uriah came home and things got complicated. See, David was overcome with guilt and afraid Uriah would find out what happened, so David started doing what so many of us do when we give in to temptation. He tried to keep his mistake a secret. He went so far as to have Uriah sent back out to the battle so that he might be killed and this whole thing would just go away. So just to keep this whole mess straight, temptation led David to sin with Bathsheba. Then the guilt, fear, and shame he felt led him to order the killing of Bathsheba's husband. Not good, right? David knew what he did was wrong. He knew he was making mistake after mistake after mistake, but he kept going. Why would he do that? Well, I think it was because David believed he had no way out. Maybe he thought he was stuck in the mess he'd made. He just didn't know how to change the story. And in the middle of that, David also felt really distant from God. We know that because he actually wrote about it in a passage from the book of Psalms in the Bible. There, David wrote that he felt a lot of the same feelings that I know I feel when I struggle with temptation. He used phrases like crushed and cast out and joyless to describe it. Is anybody with me? But here's what we also know to be true about David's story. It didn't end there. God didn't give up on him. He didn't abandon him. He didn't throw his hands in the air and say, well, David, you gave in to temptation. There's nothing I can do with you now, so that's it. David actually did a lot of great things after this part of his story, but in order to really go on with his life, David had to do one thing. He had to ask for God's forgiveness. In one of the Psalms, David wrote this prayer asking for God's forgiveness. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. In other words, David prayed this: forgive me of my sins, God. Forgive me for giving into something I knew wasn't good for me. Help me get over the guilt I feel over what I've done. Change my heart. Help me to want to follow your ways instead of my own. Now, David still had to face some major consequences from those bad choices, but because he had forgiveness, he could walk forward without fear or guilt or shame holding him down anymore. He knew his story could start again, and the same can be true for us. See, giving into temptation doesn't have to be the end of the story. We don't have to stay stuck in the choices we've made or the feelings we feel because of them. Forgiveness was the key for David, and it's the key for you and me too. I told you a story of a friend who I said some pretty nasty things about. And what was really good was that it didn't end there. See, we're still friends to this day, and it's because in that moment when she confronted me and said, "Did you say this about me?" the only thing I could do was to say, "Yes. And I am so sorry. Obviously, that's not really how I feel about you. Obviously, that was something that I should not have done. I was just tempted in the moment, and I just owned it. I just owned up to her, and in humility, in the best way that I knew in my 14-year-old self, I said, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And thankfully, she had enough grace. Not immediately, she was still pretty upset, but eventually she had enough grace to say, I forgive you, and I love you, and we're still cool. You see what I mean? Giving into temptation doesn't have to be the end of the story. And that's because of forgiveness. So if you've found yourself wondering what to do next, if you're struggling with guilt or fear or shame after giving into a temptation, if you're finding yourself making mistake after mistake after mistake, well, a different story is possible. And here's how it starts. First, ask God for forgiveness. Go to God just like David did. Confess what it is that you're struggling with. Tell him about how it's made you feel. Ask for God's help to change your story and ask for his forgiveness. Remember, there's nothing that can separate you from God's love, and there's nothing he won't offer you his forgiveness for. So start by walking forward today and asking him for it. And then ask others to forgive you. Asking God for forgiveness is the most important step in moving forward, but making things right with others is important too. When we make poor choices, it often affects those around us. And part of moving on and moving forward is taking responsibility for the mistakes that we've made. When you disobey your parents, you need to admit what you did and ask them to forgive you. When you've lied to a friend, you need to ask for forgiveness. When you've spread that rumor you knew wasn't true, you need to be honest and ask for forgiveness. It's not fun, but it's important. And it's part of what will help you move on. And next, forgive yourself. Sometimes this can be the hardest step to take. Even when you know God has forgiven you and you've heard a friend say, I forgive you, you can't seem to forgive yourself. You beat yourself up and you worry that you'll mess up again. And when you get stuck here, keep reminding yourself of God's forgiveness. Ask for his help to remember that your story isn't over. And then make a new plan. If you don't want to find yourself in the same situation in the future, you've got to figure out what to do differently now. You've got to make a new plan to avoid that temptation. And that might mean making some tough choices, like not hanging out with certain friends, or having your parents put restrictions on your phone or your computer, or not listening to certain music, or asking to sit in a different seat in class. Whatever you need to do, do it. Make a new plan and consider telling somebody like your group leader about it. Ask them to help you stick to that plan and encourage you as you do. And remember, giving in to temptation doesn't have to be the end of the story. You got this.